Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure indeed to be part of this discussion on anti-terrorism law, for me with reference to Swaziland. But let me give you a brief background about Swaziland. First of all, I must say that having been here for about 10 months, I've been inspired by the US democracy, even though it's got challenges. It is a country that you can still speak without fearing that you're going to have a funny knock in the middle of the night or in the early hours of the morning. That's what the president said early this year, which is not the case in many of our countries. Briefly, we became independent from Great Britain, and John is here, a British friend of mine, on September 6, 1968. And like many of the former colonies of Britain, we were handed, a written constitution with the Bill of Rights, creating the three arms of government. Therefore, attempting to leave us with the culture of the rule of law in Swaziland. Indeed, the country was a multi-party-based parliamentary system of government. But history tells us that the then king, His Majesty King Mswati II, was not happy with competitive politics. And the idea of multi-party politics in his mind was a foreign element. And therefore, on April 12, 1973, he unlawfully repealed that constitution without following the laid down procedure on how Parliament would have otherwise gone about to amend it if there were problems with that. And from that day on, Swaziland had been, living under this dark cloud of oppression, with the supremacy of the monarch, without checks and balances, as it were. That is the background under which this terrorism law must be understood. But in 2005, the country is said to have made some kind of a turnaround when we adopted some kind of a constitution again, which sought to bring back the fundamental rights and freedoms, and claiming therefore that the country is some kind of a constitutional monarchy. But those of us who seem to claim to understand the principles of rule of law argue that this constitution does not take us anyway closer to democratic governance, with the system respecting fundamental rights and freedoms. Again, ensuring that rule of law, is the main principle for governance in Swaziland. Because of that contention around the legitimacy or otherwise of the constitution, people have said that it does not reflect, the will, of the broader Swaziland population. And we argue that it is therefore illegitimate, not credible, and the country must again engage in a process where we can craft a constitution in which we can all claim ownership. We understand that a constitution must enjoy the ownership of the people. That's not the case for Swaziland. And because of that debate around whether the country is indeed a democratic country now, given the constitution, there's been several events taking place in the country. And in 2008, coming to the topic of today, the Parliament of Swaziland, which is a parliament elected by the people through what we call constituencies. So the people would elect an individual at the local area. That person goes directly into parliament. But that person, is not supposed to be a member of a political party, because political parties are by law banned in Swaziland. Therefore, the whole question of democracy remains contested in my country. There's no question about that. It was for that reason that with the global war on terror, as it were, with events or acts which some of us view to be acts of sabotage against symbols of the regime, the government put in place this law. Now, I think most of us in this room will agree that the problem with terrorism is the lack of a comprehensive, authoritative definition of what we mean, by the offense of terrorism at international level. If we lack a definition of this concept at that level, it becomes more difficult, for governments to craft legislation with a narrow definition of terrorism. Now, the first problem with the Swaziland legislation is that it gives a very wide definition of an act of terror. And my friends in the US will agree with me that the US Patriot Act, falls in the same, difficulty with wide, provisions of these offenses. The effect of that, obviously, is the suppression of fundamental rights and freedoms. We argue that with this wide definition of terrorism in the Act, the democratic rights, which are supposed to be enjoyed in an otherwise democratic society, the right to free association and assembly, the right to free expression and free speech, the right to a free and independent media, are obviously undermined. The example of how this act has undermined these rights, happened for us, the very first month the act was enacted, because two of the leading opponents of the system, one political party formed in 1983 called the People's United Democratic Movement, otherwise in short PUDEM, and its youth wing, which is called the Swaziland Youth Congress, became the first victims of this act. Section 28 says that the Attorney General may advise the Prime Minister to list an individual or a group whom they have reason to believe that it is committing acts of terror. And using that section, these two groups were then listed as terrorist organizations, because, as I've said, of a spate of acts of sabotage against symbols of the regime. Now, the difficulty is that in order to list, somebody or a group as a terrorist group or as a terror, as it were, you don't need to have some evidence, or you don't put it before that person or group to say, can you dispute whether you are a terrorist group or a terror, as it were. So these groups were listed even before they were given a hearing to dispute whatever evidence government may have had against them. That was the beginning. And the second move that government adopted to implement the act was that the leader of the PUDEM was then arrested under Section 5 of the Act for having made statements which, in the view of government, were words supporting terrorism. Section 5 says that statements which are uttered by somebody and are perceived to be made in support of terrorism would warrant that the person be charged and be tried for that. And Mario Masugu was arrested, is the leader, was arrested because in 2008, a bomb exploded under a bridge in Swaziland, and two people died that I had known for a long time myself. And at the funeral of one of his colleagues, he spoke, not saying that bombs must be planted all over the country. He said was to the effect that if government does not open up space for dialogue to allow those who feel that the way the country's government should express themselves, we are going to see many young people being tempted to engage in these acts, of sabotage, which government understood to be acts of terror. That statement, government said it was a statement supporting terrorism. He came before court in 2009 on a half-day trial, which I was involved in. He was acquitted because the court said there is no way you could equate this statement, to terrorism. But he had already spent about 10 months, in jail, because we thought that allowing him for bail would delay the trial. So to speed up the trial, we said let's not go for bail so that we can put pressure on government to bring him to trial, and that's how it worked. Many other people have been arrested under the act for wearing T-shirts or caps that belong to the banned organization. 2 other colleagues were arrested on July 18, 2009 in a gathering of civil society where people came together to recognize Nelson Mandela's birthday, and using that to usher a program for moving forward for Swaziland. And 2 colleagues, one came wearing a T-shirt of the banned organization. One person shouted a slogan. In Africa, we shout a lot of slogan and we sing a lot. So this guy, said, "Viva Pudemo, viva! Viva Soyoko, viva!" And I'm sure most of us have followed the South African struggle where this Viva and Amanda were the slogans to give, more credibility, more support to the struggle. And the 2 guys were arrested, one for saying Viva Pudemo, Viva Soyoko, one for wearing the T-shirt of the organization. The government released them on bail. They're currently out on bail now, awaiting trial. But I think the significance of it came last year. Like many countries of the world, workers came together on May 1 to commemorate the Workers' Day in Swaziland. A colleague, Sipojele, his name is Sipojele, came to attend the gathering, and he happened to be a member of a trade union. And at that point in time, he was in the executive council of the trade union. And he also was a member of this banned political party, Pudem. He was arrested, again for having put on the T-shirt. What is said about it is that 2 days after his arrest, it was reported that he had hanged himself in prison. That is, at least now, the extent to which anti-terrorism law has been used in Swaziland to silence